Thank you for attending this webinar to learn about applying for a whale tail grant. Please use the question box to type any questions you have, and those will be answered after the presentation. All attendees will be muted throughout the webinar. After the webinar, this PowerPoint and script will be posted on the grant's webpage along with a recording of this session.
Hi, I'm Chris Perry, and I manage the Public Education Unit for the Coastal Commission.
And I'm Annie Kohut-Frankel. I coordinate our grants program. We've listed our phone numbers here because we encourage people to call us to discuss your individual project before you write a proposal, so we can talk to you one-on-one about your ideas. During this webinar, it will be helpful if you have a copy of the application packet in front of you. We'll be showing a lot of text on some of the screens, most of which is taken directly from the application packet. We don't want you to try to read it all during the webinar. It's there to show you the section of the application packet that we're talking about at the moment.
We're going to begin by talking about the types of projects and project activities that have been funded by this grant. Keep in mind that these are examples and it's not an exhaustive list. We've funded hundreds of projects and there really is no typical project, but we'll describe some of the more common ones. After that, we'll walk you through the selection criteria and the application process. Then we'll end by answering your questions. So as Annie said, type your questions into the question box as they occur to you, and we'll address them at the end.
So what you see on your screen is the cover sheet of the grant application packet. And we've put the purpose of these funds right there on the cover sheet. It says that the funds support programs that teach California's children and the general public to value and take action to improve the health of the state's marine and coastal environments. So what can that look like? We fund a lot of different kinds of projects targeting either the general public or targeting youth, including hands-on marine science lessons and activities, and a lot of experiential learning in the field. This doesn't have to be on the coast, although often it is, but it could be at a creek or in a science center or elsewhere. We fund quite a bit of bus transportation because, as we probably don't have to tell most of you, there's a big need for bus money. This is usually funded as part of a larger education program. We can also fund education programs that take place on boats. We can fund tide pool studies. We funded some interesting citizen science projects. We've also funded plenty of projects that take place at school. Also projects that take place in museums. We've funded videos. And we've funded professional development for teachers. There's a subcategory of grants for climate change education, which funds projects dealing with topics like sea level rise, ocean acidification, or other things having to do with climate change in the coastal and ocean environments.
Continuing with examples of what we fund, this grants program has a big emphasis on environmental stewardship, meaning taking action to help care for the coast and other environmental resources. For example, a project might involve participants in native habitat restoration. Here's another example, pollution prevention messaging through storm drain art. In this example, signs to protect snowy plovers on this beach in San Diego were designed by school kids. Another example of stewardship is a shoreline cleanup. Ideally, we like to see that the stewardship aspect is well integrated with any educational aspect. So there's context that helps give the stewardship activity meaning to the participants. And this brings me to the shoreline cleanup and enhancement funding category. This can be used by current Adopt a Beach program managers that want to add an educational component to their cleanups. But it's also open to other organizations for projects that involve the public, like dune restoration or river cleanups or wetland restoration or other shoreline enhancement projects. Our other two broad funding categories are youth education programs and educational programs for the general public.
People often ask if their project has to be on the coast. It does not have to be on the coast. We funded projects in Santa Ana, in San Bernardino, and Chico, and many other inland locations. But projects must still include education about the coast and ocean and how you are connected with that coast and ocean environment wherever you may be. For example, if you're teaching about watersheds and where people are in their watershed, include the downstream end too. Or if you're doing a project on an inland waterway, there's content that you could incorporate like tides or salinity or estuaries if those are relevant to where you are. It's also common for inland projects to include education about migrating species like salmon. An example of a stewardship message for an inland project would be incorporating how actions taking place inland affect the coast and ocean. Moving on from what this program funds, we're going to talk a little bit about who we're trying to reach. Sometimes projects reach large numbers of people in the general public, and that's one of our funding categories. Otherwise, we're trying to reach people, both youth and adults, who are underserved in terms of accessing marine education and coastal opportunities. So who are people who don't often have access to marine education and stewardship opportunities? They could be low-income populations, multicultural or English language learning communities, or people in urban or inland or rural areas.
We have another funding subcategory, which is for organizations with annual operating budgets of $500,000 or less that are working with underserved communities. This isn't a specific amount of money set aside for this, but the Coastal Commission views this as a way to help level the playing field for organizations that don't have a large capacity or dedicated fundraising staff.
So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to have a lot of text on some of these slides, but this text is taken directly from the application packet. If you're following along with the packet in front of you, you can find the page number to refer to at the top of the slide. So you can see this is from page 3. Now we're going to we're going through all the elements of your application, and we'll give you some tips, and we'll try to clear up any potential confusion. So first, we'll walk you through our scoring system. The first criteria is the project's educational impact or environmental improvement. This is number 1 on page 3. These grants are really for educating about marine and coastal environments, as well as for improving those habitats. The stronger the educational experience will be, the more points your proposal will receive.
One way to think about educational impact is, what are the participants going to learn and experience, and what do you hope they will come away with from the project? In other words, we're using the term education broadly to encompass knowledge, but also experiences and the cultivation of a stewardship ethic.
The second criteria is need. The more need you demonstrate for your project, the more points you'll get. The need could be people needing something they don't already have access to, or it could be an environmental problem that needs addressing, or it could be both.
This criteria is about the why of your project. In other words, your application should make the case as to why your project is important and needed. The third criteria is project concept, which is essentially about your idea and your design. The elements listed here are ones that we believe would contribute to an impactful project design. To elaborate on some of these, the way we're thinking about culturally competent approaches has 2 main aspects. One is related to your staff and their ability to effectively engage with your audience. And the second is whether your program content is culturally relevant for your audience. And we're encouraging projects to reflect research-based best practices. This term refers to strategies that have been field tested and found to increase positive outcomes, such as increased knowledge and awareness, positive attitudes towards the environment, critical thinking skills, stewardship intentions and behaviors, and enjoyment. Some quick examples are focusing on real-world problems that are relevant to the audience, providing longer and/or repeated experiences that include preparation and time for reflection, and fostering a sense of ownership and empowerment as part of the program. We recognize that since we fund a wide range of types of projects, these and other best practices will not apply to all of them, but it's something to consider. And to help with that, there's a research-based best practices link on the Whaletail Grants website and in the guidelines, which includes findings and links to other resources. We'll also take into consideration the potential the project has for continuing after the grant ends and/or its potential for building organizational capacity. And the last thing listed here is the project's degree of impact relative to cost, or as we sometimes refer to it, the bang for the buck. And this next slide, which is also part of project concept but is for extra credit, speaks to how a project would have benefits beyond the organization and its programs to assist other organizations, help the field, or build meaningful collaborations.
The reason this is extra credit is it isn't at all required, but this is a way to recognize the value of doing that. And finally, the fourth criteria is proposal content and project implementation. We're looking for well-developed ideas where you've already figured out a lot of the details, a good evaluation plan, and a good budget.
One way to think about this criteria is to look at your proposal from the point of view of the reader. Ask yourself questions such as, does it paint a clear and complete picture of what you want to do? Are there areas that are vague and could leave the reader with questions? A good practice is to have someone unfamiliar with the project read through it and see if it makes sense to them.
This criteria also covers how likely it seems that the project will succeed and turn out well, and whether all the needed pieces are in place. Now we're going to move to the bottom of page 4 of the application packet, which is the application procedure. When you're putting together your application, the first thing that goes on top is the application summary, which is what you're looking at here. The form itself is on page 8 of the packet. The applicant organization is the organization name you want written on a check if you get a grant. If you have a fiscal sponsor, you can write the fiscal sponsor's name and a slash and then the project name. The contact person is the person who wants to be notified whether or not your proposal receives funding. So who do you want us to contact? For the project title, you can make up whatever name you want. You don't have to repeat the name of the organization in the project title. Also, we give our commissioners a report of every grant application that came in, and in the format of the report, there's room for about 7 words for the project title. So if your title is longer than about 7 words, we may end up shortening it for you. The brief project summary is an important part of this cover sheet. What you write here shouldn't include the why or the how of your project. Really what we want here is the what and maybe the who. So I'm going to share a few project summary examples. This one is very short. It's just 1 sentence. It's shorter than most, but it does the job, and this project was funded. So it says, International Bird Rescue will pilot an education project in Solano and Napa counties to share our expertise in the care of sick and injured marine birds, provide local youth with hands-on learning opportunities, and inspire conservation of waves, wetlands, and watersheds. This one is only 2 sentences. The Community Shuttle Program provides free shuttle bus transportation to our local national park sites for residents and community groups from diverse urban neighborhoods. Our program includes an orientation for every group, guided hikes, stewardship and volunteer activities, and other structured park activities to meet expressed needs and interests. So that's the what and the who. And this one is a bit longer with more details, but it fit in the space and summarizes what will happen during the project. If you find that your cover sheet is longer than 1 page, you should do more editing and make sure that it stays within 1 page. For the, let's see here. For the number of people served, it's useful for us to see both the core number of people served by your project, as well as the number of people who are less directly involved. You can leave the second line blank if it doesn't apply to your project. For the requested amount, keep in mind that there are 2 funding levels for this grant. The small grants are $12,000 or less, and the large grants are from $12,001 to $50,000. Small grants won't be that helpful for every project, but if you decide your project can afford to ask for $12,000 or less, that may increase your chances somewhat because we have to fund a minimum of 25% of the budget on smaller grants. So the bar usually doesn't end up being quite as high in that category, and it's usually a little bit easier to get a small grant. On the other hand, if you want to ask for a larger grant, and a lot of people do, also keep in mind that even though we say the maximum is $50,000, in reality, $50,000 grants are pretty rare. So just remember, if you're going to ask for a large grant in the $40,000 to $50,000 range, the bar will be higher the more you ask for. So be prepared to make a strong case for your project. And the last point I want to make about this cover sheet is that the person who prepared the grant can sign it. This doesn't need to be a director or other high-level representative.
Okay, then after the cover sheet comes the body of your proposal, and we're now at the bottom of page 4 of the application. You'll start by writing a little bit of background. Focus on how your idea for the project got to this stage. What was the genesis for your project? Is it a new project or something that's been ongoing? Have you gotten funding for this project before? And if it's an ongoing project, this is a place to talk about past results. Don't worry about discussing everything that you want to do next. All of that should come later.
Next comes the biggest part of the proposal, the project description, which is 6 sections. We're currently on page 4 and 5 of your application packet. So the first section of the project description doesn't have to be long. It's the goals and objectives, which are a summary of what you hope to accomplish without all the details included yet. At the end of your project, you'll be assessing how well you met your objectives.
Taken together, the objectives should accomplish the goals. And ideally, the objectives are measurable indicators of success.
Here are a few real examples of what a list of goals and objectives can look like. So you see this project listed several goals. For example, low-income youth will learn about environmental issues and marine and coastal stewardship. And that was followed by a few measurable objectives that specifically list how the overarching goals will be met. So 15 high school students will complete a summer program and demonstrate increased understanding. Here's another example. This one also lists very specific measurable objectives that will accomplish a short list of goals. So the goals are at the top and then all the objectives are listed underneath. And here, each goal has its own corresponding objectives listed out.
How you decide to format your goals and objectives will depend on what makes sense for your project. For example, a format like this might not work as well for a project in which some of the objectives serve more than one goal. So the main point here is just to go for clarity and precision in laying out your goals and objectives. And this will also help keep your project on track and will simplify your evaluation process.
So page 5 of the application packet. The next section of the project description, section B, is all about who you're going to serve, how you're going to reach them, and why you want to work with them. The more you can say about the target audience and the planning you've put into reaching them, the better.
The third section of the project description, section C, is the project details. This is really the heart of your whole proposal. It should be where you elaborate on your objectives and put the longest, most detailed description of what you want to do and how you're going to do it. This is also where you can put details about educational content and describe what participants will actually be learning and doing. This is a list of some points to consider in your write-up that will help us understand your project. And these are all listed on page 5 of the application packet. We're interested in knowing how intensive your program is in terms of days or hours of programming. If you have a curriculum, we'd like to see it, or you can include a link to it. And by the way, if you're including a hard copy of a curriculum, you only need to include one copy with your application. We also want to know about products, such as any new program materials you're planning to create, who the partners are that you'll be working with, and what plans you have for outreach and publicity about your project. As we discussed before, we want to hear about project design considerations like cultural relevancy, age appropriateness, inclusivity, and research-based best practices. We'd also like to know if this is a one-time project or one that is planned to be ongoing and continue beyond the grant period. And if you're submitting a proposal for a project that was had previously received a Whale-tail grant, you should include a summary of what was accomplished with the prior grant and how this new proposal builds on that. So that's all part of section C, the project details. Section D of the project description is for information about key staff. This is your chance to talk about who will be carrying out the project, their roles, and their relevant qualifications and experience. We know that staffing is a key factor in terms of project impact. And here is where you can talk about how your staff will contribute to your project success. And if you haven't yet hired staff, you can explain the process for filling the positions and what qualities and qualifications you'll be seeking.
Section E of the project description is the statement of need for the project. If possible, we'd like you to get specific and talk about why this particular project is important and what particular need it is filling. Your project will stand out to the extent that you can describe how your project is designed to meet a need of your particular audience or your particular community or the particular environment you want to work in.
We have a few examples for you of statements of need that get down to the particulars. And these are all excerpts of longer project descriptions from projects that were funded by Whale-tail grants in the past. Here it says, ingestion of microtrash by condor nestlings has been found to be one of the main limiting factors in condor population growth in the wild. This need statement relates to a project by Ventana Wilderness Society in Big Sur to California condor preservation. And the project included visitor education and cleanups of microtrash at highway pullouts. This need statement is for the Audubon project that we highlighted earlier that involved student-designed signs to educate the public about least-turn nesting in San Diego. And it says human disturbance, vandalism, and other volatile behavior have been observed at least-turn nesting sites in Mission Bay. A pilot project in 2009 documented decreases in vandalism and disturbance at Silver Strand State Beach. Wildlife Agency staff has asked the program to be expanded.
A project by Outdoor Outreach in San Diego served teens from low-income, park-poor communities who face multiple barriers to the outdoors. The application described these barriers, such as transportation, safety, lack of green spaces, and makes the connection between getting students outside and the future of the coast. So, quote, a healthy and inclusive California coastline in the future is dependent on engaging diverse youth in coastal conservation. So these are some examples of identified needs that drove projects. However, we recognize that there are important broad societal needs that drive projects, and you may not have anything more specific than that, and that's okay too. And finally, the last section of the project description is section F, and we're now on page 6 of the application packet. We just talked about the need for the project. This section asks about a different kind of need, the need for the funding in order to make your project happen. Here is also where you can describe any longer-term funding plan for the project to the extent that the project is intended to continue beyond the term of the grant. What happens when this funding is spent? And that's the end of the project description, which should take you between 3 and 6 pages to complete.
Now let's go over the evaluation plan. Although we ask about the evaluation plan in a separate section from the project description, they really should be very closely linked and both planned around project goals and objectives. Many of our grantees plan and conduct their evaluations in-house. Some hire consultants, and either way is fine. Your choice is really going to depend on your organization's in-house capabilities and on budget considerations. We're advising you to allocate between 5 and 15% of a project budget to evaluation as a very rough guideline. This is a pretty broad range because, again, we're looking for what makes sense for your particular situation. For example, a modest project that uses a proven model might warrant a more basic evaluation effort than, say, for example, a project that has very ambitious goals and is looking to scale up. This slide shows the rest of the evaluation plan instructions from the grant application, and it's about determining the method or a combination of methods that would be most helpful for learning about your project. A lot of environmental education programs rely primarily on a pre-post survey and metrics for evaluation, and that is totally fine and maybe all that is needed. Surveys are efficient and they can help describe results from a range of participants over time. But it's worth considering the range of evaluation methods available because they each have different strengths. For example, interviews with participants can help fill in the story behind the numbers and can be especially helpful at guiding program improvement. This is a very big topic, but I'll stop there and just point out the last thing on this slide, which is a link to an online evaluation guide that could be helpful to you in navigating this process. And there's also a link to the guide in the application itself and on the Whaletail Grants page.
Most projects won't require any permits, but in case yours does, then here is the place to list permits. The most common permit we see is probably a collection permit if you want to have a touch tank, for example. Or you could mention if you have permission from a landowner to do restoration on the property, for example. But the permit section probably won't apply to most of your projects. The next part of the application is the task list and timeline, which is evidence of a solid, well thought out plan. Keep in mind that the earliest a timeline can start is March 2020, which is after the funding becomes available. And some tasks will need to start by June 30th, 2020, which is the end of our fiscal year. So you'll have to be doing something before the end of June. Sometimes people wonder how long a grant should last. That's up to you. If you have a very finite project that will be done by the end of the summer, then your timeline will just be a few months. Often the timeline is a year or until the end of the next school year, or it can be even 2 years. The latest your project could end, if you need this long, is April of 2022. It's up to you what you want the task list and timeline to look like. It can be a simple bullet list like you see here, or it could be a table like this one, or even a more complicated chart if that's what helps you get organized. And next we come to the budget. These numbers, combined with the budget details form, should give a good overview of what you're proposing. What we're looking at is found on page 9 of the application packet. So you see that there are 2 columns here, and the first column is for listing the funding you're requesting from the Whale Tail grant. If the project budget is larger than that request, you'll use the second column to list the total project expenses. I want to emphasize that Whale Tail grants are paid by reimbursement only. So keep in mind that for everything that you list in the grant request column, you're going to need to invoice us after you've paid the costs up front or received a bill. This grant cannot front you money for expenses. I also want to point out some things that we aren't allowed to fund. This money cannot pay for insurance or for buying or making things that you're going to sell. It can't pay for private gifts like raffle prizes or gift cards. We will not make a grant for the purchase of a vehicle. And we can't pay for food except in the course of an overnight trip. So that means we can't pay for snacks or lunch for a meeting or during a day-long field trip. And this is the footnotes on that page that we were just looking at, and I'm showing it to you because they are important, and so you should read them. So for example, number 2 explains the maximum percentage for benefits, which is 46.5% of the amount requested for salaries. That will likely be lower for most organizations. Number 4 is about how our auto travel reimbursement is always based on the IRS reimbursement rate, which currently is 58 cents per mile. And number 5 says that you can request some funds for indirect costs, which are also sometimes called overhead. These have to do with the cost of doing business for your organization and are separate from the other direct expenses that are specifically for carrying out the proposed project. To figure out the most you can request for overhead, look at the amount you're requesting for total personnel, and then take 10% of that number. That's the maximum we can pay for indirect costs. The next form in the application packet shows you your budget details. This is page 10. You don't have to use this form, but you need to include something that shows how you arrived at the math for the amount you're requesting. This is where you need to list the different positions that would be funded by this grant if you're requesting money for positions, and you need to tell us how much they would be paid. As a general rule, grantee employee salaries shouldn't be much higher than the equivalent state employee salaries, so we will be reviewing what you put down here on that basis. If you list grant funding for supplies and materials, please list the major items here so it's clear what you're requesting money for. And at the bottom, there's a place to briefly explain any travel costs that are included in your budget. For example, you might write bus rentals for field trips or mileage for traveling to the project site. And you do need to realize that travel outside of California cannot be funded by this grant.
Next is a resolution or letter from someone with authority from your organization. People aren't always sure what this should look like. Public agencies often require a formal resolution. For other organizations, it depends on your organization's protocol. For some, it's a letter from a board chair or a treasurer. And for a lot of you, the letter could be from an executive director or a finance director or someone like that who's authorized to sign contracts and submit grant proposals. We've included a link on the Whaletail Grants webpage, Examples of Grant Resolutions, where you can see several examples of the different types of documents that you could use. This is the only part of your application that can be submitted after the deadline if that's necessary. Next comes basic background information on your organization. A lot of it may be content that you already prepared that you can just insert, like a board list or your annual budget. And the annual budget is required for everyone except for public agencies and schools.
And finally come the attachments. So we're on page 7 of your application packet. If you're a nonprofit organization, you need to include proof of your nonprofit status. Please include a site list or a map of where you would be working. You can include brochures about your organization or project if you have them. And any other supporting materials are optional. As an example, letters of support are helpful if they come from project partners, like if you want to work with a school, you can get a letter from them. It's not required, but it's helpful to know if they're already on board. Don't forget that the postmark deadline is Monday, November 4th. We do require that you mail the application through postal mail. We really do need you to mail 2 hard copies, and there is no flexibility regarding the deadline of November 4th. Keep in mind, though, that it's a postmark deadline, so we don't want you to spend extra money to express mail it to arrive on Monday. We're just going to look at the date, the postmark date that's stamped on the envelope. That's the only thing that you need to worry about.
Here's the timeline for what happens next. Annie mentioned our postmark deadline, November 4th. Then the review process happens through early January, and we'll have funding recommendations by early February. Those are the recommendations to the California Coastal Commission, at which point we'll notify all applicants. The Coastal Commission will vote on final funding decisions at its meeting in February, and grant agreements will be completed between March and June of 2020.
And now there's time to ask questions. So if you have specific questions about your individual projects, please call us later to talk about it. But right now, you can go ahead and use the question box if you want to ask about something in this presentation, or if you had another question about something we haven't covered. We're going to take a moment to look through your questions, so there'll be a little bit of silence, but we are still here, and we're looking through the questions. Feel free to sign off if you're not interested, but we will stay here and answer everything that we can. So we got a question, can projects be fiscally sponsored? Yes, projects can be fiscally sponsored. And in that case, that would be the organization that will need to provide proof of nonprofit status, for example, and checks will be made out to the fiscal sponsor.
Another question is, can a single organization offer 2 proposals? The answer is yes. We will accept more than one proposal from a single organization. with the caveat that you're very unlikely to be awarded funding for 2 proposals. So you can weigh that into your decision making if you have one of the 2 that you strongly prefer. Two questions.
This is one. So the question is, can we use this grant to pay for some additional staff costs? For example, additional staff that will be specifically working on this project to support the core staff paid by the organization. I would say the answer is yes.
Yes, not a problem. You can use this funding for any staff costs, and there's not a limit in terms of your overall budget on how much of it goes to staff. You can do that. The whole budget could be staff if that's what you need.
Someone asked if participants will receive the slides. We are going to post the PowerPoint, including the script, on the grant website, and we'll also, assuming the recording worked, we will post a video of the webinar as well. And the next question is, when will it be posted? If I can do it tomorrow, I'll do it tomorrow, and if not, it will be Monday, but I'll try and get it up tomorrow.
This question is, would a program that develops a new curriculum and distributes that to schools across our county be eligible? Yes, that is an eligible project, assuming that it relates to the topic at hand, marine and coastal education. And another question, what about a week-long trip at Marin Headlands for 6th grade students from a Title I school? Yes, again, that's an eligible project for this grant. And for all of these specific questions, we are very happy to talk to you about any details that you want to ask us about, but in general, that's an eligible project activity.
So someone asked, will we fund a project you funded previously, or will we need to revamp, redesign the project entirely? It's not common that we fund a project we funded previously, but it does happen, and it is allowable for you to apply for that. It doesn't have to be redesigned completely, but we'll want to see how it turned out. How did your previous project turn out, and how are you building on it for this new grant?
Yeah, I would say it's rare that we would just refund the same project. So, but we often fund phase 2 of a project or something along those lines, like Annie described. Is the annual budget for the 2020 calendar year or the 2019 calendar year? Whatever budget you have that is most recent is fine. So if you only have 2019, that's fine. If you have the 2020 already in hand, that's great too. If we apply for a larger grant but are not awarded for the larger amount, can we still be considered for the smaller grant? I think this question is talking about the small grant category, which is 12,000 or less. And the answer to that is yes. We do at times partially fund a project. We will always consult with the project applicant to make sure that they would be interested in accepting a smaller amount, but that does happen. I think that if it's a much larger amount and you want to be also considered for the smaller grant, you could describe that in your proposal so we understand what the parameters of what the smaller project would look like, but that definitely is a possibility.
Okay. So this next question is, can you please clarify the beginning and ending dates for planning and or program activities? So the earliest that you could start would be March 2020. We have to get the grants approved and get contracts completed. So the earliest that would be possible is March. You will have to do something, whether it's purchase something or spend some time working on your project before the end of June 2020. So you have to do something that you're going to invoice us for that happened by the end of June. And then otherwise, it depends on your project, how long the grant will be. It should take the amount of time that you need to complete your project, but it can't take longer than April of 2022. April of 2022 would be the last time, the end date that would be possible for this grant cycle.
Is a project that focuses on the San Francisco Bay, technically an estuary, eligible, or should there be a bigger emphasis on the ocean or marine environment? This question comes up frequently, and our answer is we do fund projects that take place or focus on San Francisco Bay, but we want to see as part of the project that it includes the how the bay is connected to the ocean and the watershed in general. So if it was a very specific project just on San Francisco Bay and there was no context for the larger watershed and the connection to the ocean, that would probably not score highly. However, if all of those connections are made, that would be a fine project, and we've funded a number of examples like that.
So this question says, can a grant be submitted for a project that already exists for continued support? And the answer is yes. If so, would the goals, objectives, details be specific to the program as a whole or only apply to capacity building? I think we want to see what will be accomplished by the grant. So we don't necessarily want to see your goals and objectives for your entire organization if the grant is only funding a particular part of your work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think if it's an ongoing project, I would be interested in knowing what kinds of goals for capacity building are in place. I think that should and could be part of your goals and objectives, but I don't think you would need to limit yourself to those goals and objectives. I would also want to know educational goals and other stewardship goals, those kinds of things as well.
If you have a specific project in mind, you should give us a call if we're not fully answering your question. Are matching funds or in-kind services for other partners a factor in the criteria? For example, would a $50,000 ask be more likely to score higher if the applicant is combining this with other sources of funding for a larger project? It's not, there's no point in our scoring sheet for matching funds, but if we're looking at your project and it helps us think that it's more likely to succeed, then that will help. But you're not required to have matching funds, and it's not a box to check off on this grant application.
Right. I would add that we really just want to understand the whole project. So it would be important if you do have matching funds or in-kind services to describe that, and it can strengthen your project in many other ways, like in terms of collaboration and just what you're able to accomplish. So it's a good thing to describe. It's as Annie said, it's not a requirement that there be any kind of matching funds, but I think it can strengthen your case.
Can you reimburse expenses from earlier than March? No. That's an easy one. No. We can't reimburse expenses until we have a contract for the grant.
Let's see. If you think the budget ask is excessive for the project, will you suggest that it be lowered? That's an interesting question. I would say in many cases, not many, but in some cases where we have a large request and we're always looking at not enough money to fulfill all of the needs that we feel are important to fill, partly because we're a statewide program, we're trying to fund a broad geographic diversity of projects. So we will often ask, or at least sometimes ask, that whether or not a project could accept a lower amount. The caveat is if we think that ask is excessive for the project, that could affect how you're scored in terms of the impact versus cost. So it's not, we're also looking at the total, how your project scores on all of these different criteria. So that, I guess what my point is that it's fine to ask for a larger amount, but we're looking for projects with, even in the larger amount categories, that have a high degree of impact relative to cost. Oh, and then the second question is, what is the application success rate? Oh, this was actually a different person. Applications versus funded proposals. Typically, and this does change year to year. We don't know what this year is going to bring in terms of what comes in the door, but typically there's a 20-something% success rate in terms of applications versus funded proposals.
And Julie, don't worry. I don't think I answered that question, so I was happy to answer your question. Let's see. So we've got one last question. If you have anything you haven't asked, get it typed in real quick. This question is, does an in-school education program necessarily need an outdoor component? No. Doesn't have to. There's not a requirement for outdoor learning. A lot of the things we fund do have that, but it's not required.
Okay, so repeat the percentage of applicants funded. What I said was it's in 20%-ish range, so 20%, 22% year to year, although again, as I said, we don't know. Every year we have a somewhat different amount of funding available, and we have a somewhat different amount of applications that come in the door. So it varies year to year, but I can just say based on past experience, it's about 20%.
Okay, do we have any last questions? All right, so just a reminder, once again, our phone numbers are up there and you can call us with any individual questions. There is lots of information on the grants webpage, so make sure you look through that thoroughly. And we really appreciate your time in joining us for this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.